So I've noticed significantly more ESTJs mistype as ENTJs than the other way around. And this can be largely, if not entirely, attributed to the MBTI dichotomies of intuition versus sensing. You know, the idea that some types are just more naturally sensing and some types are much more naturally intuitive, and that's just how it is. Well, as many of you know, I'm not a massive fan of these dichotomies, and I believe they cause a heck of a lot of mistyping, but for the purpose of this video, I'm not going to get into that. Suffice to say, both the ENTJ and the ESTJ are equally intuitive and sensing in their own right. What differs is a position of sensing and a position of intuition within each respective cognitive map. But before we dive right in, I just want to recommend to anybody who hasn't already done so to subscribe to the channel and be sure to share the video with anyone whose life you think might be enriched by the contents of the video. Well, before we go out distinguishing one type from another, it's important to, first of all, illuminate the ways in which these types are similar. Well, first and foremost, these types share the same dominant function. This is extraverted thinking, the rational order of the objective external landscape. And being in a dominant position, this function is here highly convergent. This means it is an area that these types are willing to take control of, exert influence over. And there tends to be a lot of misunderstanding about what it means to be an extraverted thinking dominant. People see TE in a lead position, and they assume a very orderly personality, a very strict personality, when in reality this is often the exact opposite of what is actually going on. Being in the dominant position, extraverted thinking is actually relatively chaotic. Not in the sense that it doesn't use systems, not in the sense that it is dismissive of logic, but more in the sense that these types are very creative in their employment of it. They tend to create their own systems, enact their own change, much more than abide by the systems and rules of other people. And this is why it is in fact relatively common for an ENTJ, for example, to mistype as an ENTP. Because while the type is indeed highly industrious, they are not necessarily as orderly as common type descriptions would make them out to be. And indeed, many ESTJs and ENTJs actually enjoy a level of chaos, because it is in a chaotic environment where change can be enacted. And with each of these types sharing the same dominant function, they also share the same oppositional function. This is introverted feeling. And being in every way here the natural opposite of the dominant function, introverted feeling also opposes extroverted thinking in attitude. That is to say, where extroverted thinking is naturally convergent and thus an area of responsibility and control, of influence. Introverted feeling is here divergent and thus much more of an area of relative irresponsibility, an area of observation, much more than an area that is actively controlled. And what does this mean when put into practice? Well, with introverted feeling in the oppositional position, it is very much pushing forward an extroverted thinking agenda. Extroverted thinking is being changed, whereas introverted feeling is being abided by. And this can lead in some circumstances for both of these types having a difficulty compromising their desires. And I can also place even the identities of each of these types outside of the area of conscious control. But as I've said in my convergence versus divergence video, this is just a spectrum. And thus, of course, each of these types can abide by logic just as they can exert control over their feelings and identity. So the core similarities of both of these types are in the functions extroverted thinking in the dominant position and introverted feeling in the oppositional position. Being hyperdivergent, introverted feeling here is observed much more than it is altered, whereas extroverted thinking, being pushed forward by the agenda of the divergent introverted feeling, is enacting creative change upon the external world but not necessarily abiding by it. And now that we've presented the similarities between these types, it is now time to explore the ways in which they differ. Starting with the dominant functions. Well, we all know that the lead function here is extroverted thinking. However, the ENTJ's extroverted thinking is supplemented by an auxiliary of extroverted sensing, whereas the extroverted thinking of the ESTJ is supplemented by an auxiliary of extroverted intuition. Well, first let us look to the extroverted sensing of the ENTJ. Extroverted sensing is a very specific and concrete perception of external reality. Because it is so focused and intense, it renders what is being observed very tangible. So the ENTJ is locking onto this very singular portion of external reality and proceeding to understand it, proceeding to rationalize upon it, influence it. As such, you have somebody whose extroverted thinking agenda is locked onto the tangible and very, very, very focused in its output of energy. As much as they may enjoy managerial positions, the ENTJ would much prefer to lock onto a single task and have other tasks automatically taken care of. This is a highly focused individual with a high proclivity towards very intense extroverted sensing experience. And the whole commander stereotype associated with this individual tends to overlook and even downplay the proclivity towards performance, towards the acquisition of skills, towards a very singular, focused interaction with what is being perceived in the moment. And while the ENTJ's extroverted thinking output is highly focused and intense owing to the extroverted sensing lens to which it is assigned, the extroverted thinking output of the ESTJ is much more plethoric owing to the extroverted intuitive lens to which extroverted thinking here is assigned. And as such, the ESTJ has a much higher proclivity towards macroscopic organization, taking multiple different components at once and blending them together. Just as feeling is the opposite of thinking, intuition is the opposite of sensing. And therefore, where the ENTJ gazes upon a very singular object, the ESTJ gazes upon multiple objects at once and exerts influence across a much more macroscopic external atmosphere. With extroverted intuition as the auxiliary here to extroverted thinking, the ESTJ is much more naturally managerial in many ways, much more oriented towards project management, overseeing multiple different departments. Whereas the ENTJ tends to delegate authority out of necessity, the ESTJ delegates authority as an extension of their locus of control. And whereas the extroverted thinking of the ENTJ is highly singular, the extroverted thinking of the ESTJ is much more holistic and even more inclined towards synergy. However, while in terms of dominant functions alone, the ESTJ is clearly more intuitive, the opposing functions of each of these types are the inverse of this. So, just as how extroverted sensing and extroverted intuition determine the scope of each of these types' dominant functions, it is introverted intuition and introverted sensing that determine the scope of these types' respective introverted feeling oppositional function. So again, let us start with the ENTJ. The ENTJ's divergent auxiliary, the auxiliary to their introverted feeling, is introverted intuition. This renders their introverted feeling state much more existential and abstract by nature, much more self-transformative even as a natural byproduct of the emotional kaleidoscope that is being perceived with this extremely broad introverted intuitive lens. Being much more divergent by nature, the introverted intuitive introverted feeling of the ENTJ doesn't actively transform itself under conscious supervision as much as it does instill an extroverted thinking, extroverted sensing agenda at the behest of self-realization, of self-actualization. Owing to the relatively future tense orientation of introverted intuition, the ENTJ tends to project their desires into the future. And owing to the highly divergent, that is, highly static nature of this introverted feeling, introverted intuitive realm, once a vision has been formed by the ENTJ, compromise can be somewhat difficult. And when there is a setback, there is even a propensity here for the ENTJ to be both demoralized and somewhat confused as to how things didn't go the way they had foreseen. So putting that all together, the ENTJ naturally uses extroverted thinking and extroverted sensing to really lock onto and enact change and rationalize upon a very focused and tangible portion of objective reality. But this is all done at the behest of an introverted intuitive observation of introverted feeling. And as such, the dominant functions of the ENTJ act as an extension of an introverted intuitive, introverted feeling, self-transformation, and projection of meaningful future. However, the ESTJ's introverted feeling is being perceived by an auxiliary of introverted sensing. And this means whereas the internal world of the ENTJ is much more abstract and plethoric, the internal world of the ESTJ tends to be a lot more singular, concrete, and intense. With a highly specific and focused lens of introverted sensing perceiving their introverted feeling oppositional function, the ESTJ is a lot more singular in their self-concept. And while of course the ESTJ can form visions just like anybody else, the opposing functions of this type are rather bringing back an exploratory external agenda into an internal world much more pragmatic, into an area of recall, for example. And while of course the ESTJ can form visions just like anybody else, owing to extroverted intuition, a much more exploratory and like to see where the path goes, with all the while their opposing functions of introverted feeling and introverted sensing bringing back the exploratory agenda of the dominant functions into a realm much more pragmatic and rooted in the concrete. So you can see now how the intuition and the sensing within both of these types are essentially switched around. The intuition of the ENTJ is more limbic, whereas the intuition of the ESTJ is more cerebral. And the way this tends to manifest is the ENTJ wanting to be everything, NIFI, and do a single thing, TESE, whereas the ESTJ wants to be a single thing, SIFI, and do everything, NETE. For example, an ENTJ can form a very specific vision of the future, a desired outcome, and then really anchor in to the here and now, the raw, tangible, focused, objective atmosphere in order to maximize their output, as opposed to the more concrete limbic atmosphere of the ESTJ that essentially anchors them in as they seek to acquire more resources and spread their influence over a larger extroverted intuitive atmosphere. But these divergent auxiliary functions also serve as the authority of the respective cognitive map. And as such, the ENTJ's introverted intuition, more than just rendering the internal world of the type highly abstract, also lends the type a highly future tense orientation and need to internalize contingency, anticipate future outcome. While extroverted thinking and extroverted sensing here are more concrete, it is introverted intuition here which is extrapolating upon the concrete. Abstraction oftentimes of a highly existential and philosophical nature. By comparison, the ESTJ's introverted sensing very much draws the extroverted intuitive, extroverted thinking, exploratory nature of this type back towards a more pragmatic internal state, and as naturally exploratory and innovative as the ESTJ might be. Introverted sensing tends to beg the question, can it work? Is it practical? Can it be traced back to empirical observation? And an additional counterbalance is provided by the sub-authority of each of these types, respectively extroverted intuition within the ENTJ and extroverted sensing within the ESTJ. For example, as raw and tangible as the external world might be to the ENTJ, there is still the need to externally extrapolate upon it, render it abstract. And as abstract and plethoric as the external world might be to the ESTJ, there is still something of a compulsion to render it concrete. And as such, the ENTJ's concrete external world abides by the abstract, just as how the abstract external world of the ESTJ abides by the concrete. However, what I have not yet touched upon is the different ways in which these types employ extroverted feeling. So as I have already explored in my Cognitive Functions Explained video, which you can check out over here, there is a certain space that exists between either end of a cognitive continuum. These continuums are perception and rationality. The perceptual continuum have sensing on one end and intuition on the other, but there's actually a space in between them, just as how the rational continuum, which encompasses feeling on one side and thinking on the other, also have a space in between them. And it is through traversing this space that the ENTJ and the ESTJ can essentially dip down from extroverted thinking into extroverted feeling. However, when the dominant function dips down into the other side of its respective continuum, so does the convergent auxiliary. And as such, the ENTJ tends to employ extroverted feeling alongside extroverted intuition, lending them a kind of crowd-oriented, even gregarious, charismatic nature, and the ability to weave through and anticipate different social scenarios. Whereas the ESTJ is much more attuned to the extroverted sensing nuance of a social situation, oftentimes preferring one-on-one situations and getting even overwhelmed by a larger social setting. And conversely, since the ENTJ tends to lack that kind of extroverted sensing employment of extroverted feeling, they are not always highly attuned to the nuance of social interaction. And a potential pattern here might be for the ESTJ to have a more abrasive communication style when talking to a group, NEFE, while the ENTJ may even have a more abrasive communication style when in a more one-on-one and intense social setting. And an argument could be made that the ESTJ would find group settings more tiring, and ENTJs find more one-on-one and intense social settings more tiring. And conversely, if the dominant function were to be locked in place, and the convergent auxiliary dip into its natural opposite, there may be a certain level of disconnect within each of the types. The ENTJ might be disconnected from natural external contingency, the big picture of the external world, relying solely upon introverted intuition in order to internalize that contingency, just as how the ESTJ may experience a certain disconnect from external concrete reality, struggling to experience sensations in a more tangible manner, for example, being so fixated on the macro that they cannot perceive the micro, and oftentimes relying upon an internalized sense of concrete through the way of introverted sensing to make up for a more blurry and unconscious extroverted sensing. But just as how functions can dip into their natural opposite, so they can dip into their opposite orientation. And there are two modes here that concern the introverted thinking employments of each of these types. Mode 1 is as a natural extension of extroverted thinking. For example, an ESTJ will actually be using a heck of a lot of introverted thinking and introverted intuition as an extension of TE dialogue when they are interacting with something, when they're taking responsibility for something external, for as long as the dialogue originates from an external value. The ESTJ can actually acquire a very broad and holistic understanding of the subject matter, with introverted thinking here being perceived by a broad introverted intuitive scope. Conversely, the introverted thinking of the ENTJ, when accessed from this extroverted thinking origin point, employs a heck of a lot of introverted sensing. And as such, when accessed through an extroverted thinking medium, the ENTJ can actually be very internally precise. However, mode 2 of introverted thinking employment within each of these types is independent of extroverted thinking origin. And in these settings, the introverted intuition of the ESTJ, the introverted sensing of the ENTJ, tend to become blind spots within each of these types. And in this state, introverted thinking within the ENTJ dips down into a more murky introverted intuition, just as how the introverted thinking of the ESTJ tends to dip down into a more murky introverted sensing. And it is in this situation when the ENTJ will be much more abstract and philosophical, speaking more in vagaries, whereas the ESTJ will be much more concrete and pragmatic and specific, with the ENTJ having a hazy recall of events, losing a sense of pragmatism, of precision, and the ESTJ becoming disinterested in possibilities and abstract thought. And there is a tendency in this state for introverted thinking to dip into introverted feeling, with the ENTJ's abstraction becoming highly existential, an extension of self-concept, and the ESTJ becoming hyper-aware of specific values, perhaps even nostalgic, and indeed in some generations and cultures, even more traditional. And there's a good reason why this blind spot takes place. You see, introverted sensing as the authority function of the ESTJ, and extroverted intuition as a convergent auxiliary, both of these forces are pulling introverted intuition away. Just as how the introverted sensing of the ENTJ is being pulled away from consciousness by both introverted intuition as the authority function and a convergent auxiliary of extroverted sensing. So a quick summary. The extroverted thinking of the ENTJ has extroverted sensing as an auxiliary. This renders the external world for the ENTJ highly concrete and intense as they focus onto a specific portion of the external world. By contrast, the external world of the ESTJ is much more abstract and plethoric. Rather than focusing on a specific portion, the ESTJ spreads their energies across a larger scope. However, the intensity of that experience tends to be diluted as a result. The introverted intuitive authority function of the ENTJ proclivicates a type towards internal abstraction, just as how the introverted sensing authority function of the ESTJ essentially reins in the innovations of the dominant stack and forces the type to prioritize what could be pragmatically achieved. The introverted feeling world of the ENTJ is more kaleidoscopic, oftentimes more future-oriented, projecting even a version of the self into the future, a future desired outcome. All the while, the introverted feeling of the ESTJ is a lot more specific and intense, with values being even more hardwired, and a self very much a constant in a sea of exploratory extroverted intuitive change. ENTJs tend to handle group settings more than the ESTJ owing to the extroverted intuitive employment of extroverted feeling, and conversely, the ESTJ's employment of extroverted feeling is more oriented towards the one-on-one, the intense, and may even get less overwhelmed by emotional intensity than the ENTJ would. And finally, both of these types dip into introverted thinking, but absent an external origin point, introverted sensing within the ENTJ and introverted intuition within the ESTJ tends to be more of a blind spot. And as such, the ENTJ may struggle more with recall and theoretical pragmaticism, attentive to internalized nuance, just as how the ESTJ may, in this state, struggle with broader existential concepts and struggle to philosophize absent a pragmatic agenda. So that concludes the video. Thank you so much for watching, and if you did enjoy it, be sure to let me know by hitting that like button below. If you want to stay notified of future content, I highly recommend subscribing to the channel. And if you fancy exploring the fundamentals of CPT in more depth, I highly recommend checking out the CPT ebook. If you yourself are interested to know what type you might be, or would just like to know about how your type applies more specifically to you as an individual, I do recommend checking out the CPT type service. And finally, CPT is also on Patreon, so if you're interested in supporting the channel in a theory on that additional level, That would be massively, massively appreciated. But of course, it goes without saying, I would appreciate your support over here as well. So that is it for me, and I will be back in a week's time. For now, take care.